Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Cold War Radio, the Russian broadcasts of the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, by Mark G. Pomar, narrated by Rich Miller. Preface. The Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty are major international broadcasters, funded by the U.S. government through open congressional appropriations, and yet are virtually unknown even among the better educated and politically aware American public. Older Americans may recall the Crusade for Freedom and other media campaigns in the 1950s to solicit funding for Radio Free Europe. But in the 1980s, when I would list RFE-RL or the Voice of America as my employer, I was usually met with sheer consternation. Even in Washington, D.C., few people seemed to know what those organizations were. When I was in Cavendish, Vermont in 1984 to interview Alexander Solzhenitsyn for VOA, the hotel clerk asked if I was a member of a national singing group. Yet if one travels abroad, especially to Eastern Europe and the countries of the former Soviet Union, one quickly realizes that the two radio stations were popular American brands, loved and respected by tens of millions of dedicated listeners. Willis Conover, the legendary host of the VOA jazz program, was known throughout the world as the voice of American music. When he traveled to Poland, he was mobbed as a superstar. He had fan clubs in China, Russia, and many other countries around the world. His broadcasts were the embodiment of U.S. cultural diplomacy, giving people in the farthest corners of the world a taste of American life. The two radio stations, of course, offered much more than just music or entertainment. Alexander Solzhenitsyn referred to VOA and RFE-RL as the mighty non-military forces that reside in the airwaves and whose kindling power in the midst of darkness cannot even be grasped by the Western imagination. The well-known Soviet dissident and Israeli politician Natan Sharansky credited VOA and RL with helping dissidents survive and keeping alive the spirit of Jewish refuseniks, Soviet Jews not allowed to emigrate to Israel. By mentioning the names of human rights activists and telling their stories, the two radios often protected them from excessively harsh treatment by the KGB. Andrei Sakharov and his wife, Yelena Bonner, told Western correspondents that they received most of their news about the world from the broadcasts of VOA and RL and considered them their radios. In the 1990s, I met a young man in Tatarstan, some 400 miles east of Moscow, who, upon learning that I had worked at RFE-RL, hugged me and told me his parents had always listened to the Tatar-Bashkir service of Radio Liberty, and those broadcasts nurtured their culture. "You Americans," he said, "really cared about us." VOA and RFE-RL lend themselves to serious study as part of U.S. public diplomacy, international journalism, or Cold War history. Books by Sig Mickelson, Arch Puddington, Alan Heil, Gene Parda, Michael Nelson, Nicholas Cole, and A. Ross Johnson have contributed significantly to our understanding of international broadcasting by examining how the radio stations developed into major institutions, their relationship to the U.S. government, and the composition of the audience. Memoirs by Gene Sosin, James Critchlow, George Urban, and Viktor Franzusov have given us a sense of what it was like to work at the radio stations, and have sketched memorable portraits of the more eccentric personalities. My aim is different. I will tell the story of the radios by taking the listener inside Voice of America and Radio Liberty, and examining the conception and development of the programs of the two Russian services, and the impact those broadcasts had on the development of international broadcasting, U.S.-Soviet relations, Russian political and cultural history, and the end of the Cold War. My examination of the Russian-language broadcasts will give listeners a deeper understanding of the multifaceted role the two radios played during the Cold War, ranging from instruments of Cold War policy to repositories of independent Russian culture, literature, philosophy, religion, and the arts. Among the questions I will address are the following. What subjects were most prominent in the broadcasts? Who were the broadcasters and their guest commentators? What tone did the broadcasters adopt, even in times of crisis? How did VOA and RFE-RL handle controversial issues, including Soviet disinformation campaigns? In what ways did the two radios nurture a free and independent Russia that could exist and flourish outside of the Soviet Union? All too often, VOA and RFE-RL have been painted with a broad brush, praised or excoriated by politicians, journalists, and academics on the basis of a superficial understanding of the actual programming. Given the difficulty of tuning in the shortwave broadcasts, as well as the challenges of parsing Russian politics, philosophy, and culture, both in their Soviet and émigré incarnations, many American foreign policy experts, journalists, and Soviet and East European scholars formed their judgments about VOA and RFE-RL based on English-language summaries of the broadcasts, official policy guidance, the occasional scandal, or Soviet publications that regularly lambasted the radios. These individuals quite often painted a distorted picture of VOA and RFE-RL. By analyzing a broad cross-section of the Russian-language broadcasts, I will try to set the record straight and give listeners an opportunity to draw their own conclusions about the two radios. I will supplement my examination of the programming with references to declassified U.S. government documents, interviews with former broadcasters, and my own notes and personal papers. Although this study examines the entire Cold War, I focus primarily on the 1980s and early 1990s because this was a period of monumental political change that tested VOA and RFE-RL as they covered Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Reagan administration also made international broadcasting a high priority in the battle against communism. As Reagan said explicitly, "The West won't contain communism, it will transcend communism. It will dismiss it as some bizarre chapter in human history, whose last pages are even now being written." And as VOA and RFE-RL helped to write those last pages, they received increased funding and played a more significant role in implementing U.S. foreign policy. No less important was that by the early 1980s, the Soviet Union had expelled many leading writers, thinkers, and artists. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Mstislav Slava Rostropovich, Galina Vishnevskaya, Vladimir Voinovich, Vasily Aksyonov, and Sergei Dovlatov were among the many Russian artists and writers who were eager to lend their voices to Russian broadcasts. They commanded authority and respect in their homeland, and their interviews and programs resonated throughout the Soviet Union, allowing the two radio stations to reach a mass audience. During the Reagan and Bush administrations, I was involved in virtually every aspect of broadcasting to the USSR, first as the Assistant Director of the RL Russian Service and later as the Chief of the VOA Russian Service, Director of the VOA USSR Division, and Executive Director of the Board for International Broadcasting, the federal agency overseeing RFE-RL. I developed new programs and conducted interviews with prominent Russians, participated in high-level discussions of broadcast policy at the United States Information Agency, USIA, the Department of State, and the National Security Council, NSC, testified in Congress, took part in the first negotiations with Soviet authorities to end the jamming of RFE-RL, and opened an RFE-RL news bureau in Moscow. I had the privilege of working closely with Steve Forbes, Charles Wick, James Buckley, Gene Pell, Lane Kirkland, Kenneth Tomlinson, Michael Novak, and many other notable figures in international broadcasting. I also interviewed many prominent Russian writers, artists, and dissidents, including Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Vasily Aksyonov, and Vladimir Voinovich, and became friends with Slava Rostropovich and his wife, the opera diva Galina Vishnevskaya. By drawing on my personal knowledge, I will be able to explain how broadcast policy was formulated, the way the Russian services of VOA and RL operated, and why the two broadcasters were greeted so positively in post-communist Eastern Europe and Russia. On occasion, I will adopt a first-person narration when I draw on my personal experiences to elucidate the work of the radio stations. Before 1980, VOA and RFE-RL were generally seen as separate organizations governed by distinct missions. VOA was part of the U.S. government, located in Washington, D.C., and staffed by federal employees. Like the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, Radio France Internationale, Deutsche Welle, Kol Israel, and many other government broadcasters, VOA was a national voice, charged with explaining U.S. government policies and telling America's story with the aim of gaining the respect and goodwill of its target audience. It operated under a charter, Public Law 94-350, that stated, 1. VOA will serve as a consistently reliable and authoritative source of news. 2. VOA will represent America, not any single segment of American society. And 3. VOA will present the policies of the U.S. clearly and effectively, and will also present responsible discussion and opinion on those policies. Until the 1980s, many VOA Russian programs were translations from English sources, supplied either by the VOA Central News Division or taken from leading U.S. papers such as the New York Times, Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal. Its management and staff were cautious in their treatment of controversial political subjects, especially concerning the internal politics of the USSR. The State Department paid close attention to the Russian broadcasts. Until the 1980s, the chief of the USSR division was a senior Foreign Service officer. I was the first career civil servant to hold that position. In contrast, RFE-RL was a grantee of the U.S. government and was located in Munich before moving to Prague in the mid-1990s. It hired primarily émigrés and functioned as a surrogate station, in effect a home service located abroad. Its Russian broadcasts did not speak for the United States and presented news, feature programming, and opinions that would have been part of daily political discourse if Russia had free media and the rule of law. For the VOA Russian broadcasters, the pronoun we meant the United States. For the RL Russian broadcasters, it meant Mother Russia. Most employees worked for only one broadcaster. Books and articles were either about VOA or RFE-RL, but not both. This book breaks new ground, as I examine both broadcasters in the context of Cold War programming and the Reagan and Bush policies toward the Soviet Union. Under the Reagan administration, the sharp divide between RFE-RL and VOA began to disappear. RFE-RL's past funding by the CIA, until 1971, was no longer taboo for VOA management, and RL was eager to hire experienced VOA broadcasters. When I interviewed at VOA, I found that my RL experience was a great boon. The director, Kenneth Tomlinson, told me that he wanted dynamic programs that addressed relevant issues in the Soviet Union, and if that upset the State Department, so be it. A case in point was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. While his works were broadcast frequently on Radio Liberty, he was mostly kept off the air at VOA. Solzhenitsyn's nationalist views made him a controversial figure in the United States, while his adamant anti-communism angered Soviet authorities. To cautious U.S. policymakers, his presence on VOA was seen as unnecessarily provocative. When Tomlinson asked me if I would put Solzhenitsyn on the air, I said I certainly would. One could disagree with many of Solzhenitsyn's views, and some of his writings displayed authoritarian tendencies, but in the 1980s he was an iconic figure whose voice needed to be heard in Russia. That answer cemented the job offer. In my examination of the programming, I do not ignore the different missions of VOA and RFE-RL, but my intention is to look at the overall impact of Russian-language broadcasts on Soviet domestic politics, Russian political culture, and U.S.-Soviet relations. As a general rule, Russian listeners did not care which station they tuned in, so long as the programs were relevant and interesting. Many Russians simply called all international broadcasters voices, on occasion ironically referring to them with the Soviet cliché "Вражеские голоса," enemy voices. Introduction. To understand the significance of the Russian broadcasts of VOA and Radio Liberty, one must realize that they were a direct outgrowth of the Cold War and were viewed by U.S. policymakers as important tools in confronting and even defeating a new and dangerous enemy. Although VOA had begun broadcasting shortly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, out of deference to its Soviet ally, the U.S. government excluded Russian programming from its growing list of language services. Only in 1947, with the Cold War gaining traction, did VOA initiate Russian broadcasts that projected American policies and values and directly challenged the Soviet narrative of domestic and international affairs. In the case of surrogate broadcasting, it took until 1953 to establish Radio Liberty, with a prominent board of directors, a set of journalistic guidelines, short-wave transmitters, and a competent émigré staff. But as early as April 1948, George Kennan laid out the need and rationale for Radio Liberty's surrogate programming by employing the term political warfare, which he defined as all means at a nation's command, short of war, to achieve its national objectives. Responding to the Kremlin's growing foreign aggression, described as the most refined and effective of any in history, Kennan argued for the creation of a toolkit that could counter the USSR on many different levels. In Kennan's words, these new operations would range from such overt actions as political alliances, economic measures, and white propaganda to such covert operations as clandestine support for friendly foreign elements, black psychological warfare, and even the encouragement of underground resistance in hostile states. Kennan viewed VOA and RFE-RL as the moral high ground of political warfare because their sources and activities were open, and they were committed to presenting factually accurate news and feature programming. In today's political lexicon, he would probably have used the term strategic narrative, commonly defined as promoting a country's interests, values, and aspirations for the international order, and defining who we are and what kind of world order we want. In the 1940s, however, words such as propaganda and warfare had not yet acquired their current negative connotations. Only the initial covert funding of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty caused some officials to use the term gray operations. But gray changed to white in the early 1970s when the U.S. Congress started to fund RFE-RL through open congressional appropriations. The raison d'etre of Russian-language broadcasting was to confront the Soviet Union in a struggle that George Urban, RFE director in the 1980s, characterized as unconventional warfare, fought not with tanks and artillery, but with words, ideas, perceptions, papal visits, arguments about shopping baskets, and other soft means. These new means of warfare required new weapons that would circumvent the Soviet regime's control of domestic media and address Russian listeners directly. U.S. policymakers believed that the free flow of verified and truthful information, so fundamental to any open society, posed a direct threat to the very survival of the USSR. The intent of RFE and RL, Ross Johnson noted, was to provide listeners with an intellectual bridge to Western Europe and the United States, and a factual basis for comprehending their own lives and the world around them, so as to preserve the independent thinking that the controlled domestic media sought to prevent or suppress. By broadcasting fact-based news about the world, and especially about the internal conditions in the USSR, U.S. policymakers believed the two radio stations could significantly weaken and even defeat communism. Their goal, as George Urban observed, was to impart a sense of the right measure of things to the communist world across the whole range of human activities, to make it easier for our audiences to distinguish reality from illusion, facts from fabrications, ideas consonant with a dignified and life-enhancing conception of man and the human environment from ideas neutral or hostile to them. While the mission of VOA and RFE-RL was patriotic and aspirational, the formulation and development of the actual broadcasts proved to be complex and at times even contentious. Were current news broadcasts alone a sufficiently powerful weapon to challenge the USSR? Or did VOA and RFE-RL need to target Soviet crimes, economic failures, and aggressive foreign policy? Should the two radios focus on life in the West, thereby exposing the shortcomings of the Soviet Union only indirectly? Or should the broadcasts dwell on Soviet history and domestic problems? Did hard-hitting programming on economics, philosophy, or religion inevitably acquire aspects of propaganda? And should the radios accept the label of propaganda or resist it? From the earliest days, these questions caused heated arguments among the broadcasters themselves, competing agendas among senior American management, direct and indirect involvement of the State Department and the White House, and bitter struggles over broadcast policy in Congress. At the risk of simplification, I suggest that a useful way of making sense of the challenges facing the Russian broadcasts is to recognize the push and pull of two competing approaches to programming that emerged at the outset and, to varying degrees, coexisted throughout the Cold War years: strategic broadcasting and purist journalism. The strategic approach saw broadcasting as a weapon that could pierce the Iron Curtain and weaken communist rule. Our station has, above all, a fighting and political mission, noted Pavel Tigrid, an early editor at RFE. Our offensive is directed against communism. That fighting spirit was echoed by other founders of RFE and RL as they justified the budgets and operations of the radios in terms of U.S. national security. John Foster Dulles, Frank Wisner, General Lucius Clay, among other early Cold Warriors, favored programming that exposed Soviet hypocrisy, gave voice to marginalized groups, fostered nationalism in different ethnic republics of the USSR, and reported on violations of human rights, Stalinist rule, and the Gulag system. In the words of an early Cold War policy, National Security Policy Directive 68, radio programs should foster a fundamental change in the Soviet system. They should be designed to build and maintain confidence in our strength and resolution, and to wage overt psychological warfare calculated to encourage mass defections from Soviet allegiance. For the strategists who tended to see programming in militarized terms, Soviet censorship helped to set the daily agenda. Issues that official Soviet media distorted or ignored became lead stories for VOA and RL. Every day there were new battlegrounds, and the strategists relished their role as warriors fighting for freedom. In sharp contrast, advocates of the purist approach stressed high journalistic standards, disdained attempts at strategic narratives, favored the inclusion of non-political and cultural topics, and argued that programming reflecting liberal values would attract a large and devoted audience that could be weaned away from Soviet propaganda. The purists were adamant that the news be straightforward and comprehensive, eschewing any rumors or hearsay, and relying on the open two-source rule that allowed only publicly available news stories to be cited. From the outset, the purist view prevailed in news reporting. At VOA, the purists also advocated an American voice that reflected the diversity of American public opinion, and did not shy away from addressing the problems facing American society. They favored John F. Kennedy's admonition that VOA, as part of the cause of freedom and the arm of freedom, is obliged to tell our story in a truthful way, painting us with all our blemishes and warts. Purists at RL favored balanced, thoughtful discussions of important political issues, supplemented by programming about culture, the arts, and literature. Most important, they advocated a calm and reasonable tone that avoided gratuitous criticism of the Soviet Union, convinced that communicating the creative freedom of the West, and especially the accomplishments of Russian émigrés, would be the most effective way to gain a large and dedicated audience. They emphatically rejected strident editorial commentary or direct appeals to the Soviet population to resist communist rule. No one, of course, was exclusively a strategist or purist. Everyone at VOA and RFE-RL recognized that with the exception of the newscast at the top of the hour, all feature programming fell somewhere along the continuum between the two approaches, combining fact-based reporting with a strategic purpose of informing listeners about events that Soviet media either distorted or ignored. But in my experience, broadcasters and radio executives inevitably leaned toward one approach or the other in their fundamental conception of the radio stations. As we will discuss in the ensuing chapters, these differing views created an underlying tension that fostered acrimonious editorial meetings, ideological debates, and uneasy compromises. I recall how the appearance of Soviet dissidents and human rights activists in the VOA studios, harshly criticizing Soviet actions, was greeted as a moment of triumph by many Russian broadcasters, but seen as a selling out of VOA's high-minded mission by some of the old-school American managers. RL programming about Russian nationalist traditions and conservative thought was enthusiastically heralded by some RFE-RL executives and older émigré broadcasters as the most effective strategy to defeat communist rule, but reviled by many recent Soviet émigrés as dangerous propaganda and a sop to Russian anti-Semites. The fundamental divide between an aggressive stance and a neutral voice was further widened by overall U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union, which in the course of the Cold War first favored the radio strategists in the 1950s and then swung to the purists during the period of détente in the late 1960s and 1970s, only to return to the strategists in the Reagan years. These policy shifts principally affected official pronouncements about the radios, program guidance documents, and the hiring and retention of key senior management. The actual broadcasts operated throughout the Cold War on a relatively even keel. In the 1950s and 1960s, when the strategists held the upper hand, Russian programs included sharp critiques of the Soviet Union, occasional diatribes by political émigrés, and even some direct appeals to the Soviet population by such luminary figures as Alexandra Tolstaya, the daughter of the novelist, and Natalia Sadova, Leon Trotsky's widow. But the bulk of the programming in those years featured straight news, cultural shows, popular and classical music, and many non-political stories that would have been welcomed on any serious Western national radio. With the emergence of détente in the late 1960s and 1970s, the purists asserted that the rationale for the two radios was to promote the principles of democracy and to communicate American values through youth programming, cultural shows, and popular music. Reeling from attacks by Senator William Fulbright, who wanted to close Radio Liberty, U.S. policymakers sought to bury earlier traces of aggressive programming, and in their public pronouncements stressed VOA's and RFE-RL's commitment to a fair and balanced presentation of the news. But well-researched programs about the plight of Soviet dissidents, the travails of Jewish refuseniks, and Stalin's crimes continued to be broadcast on both VOA and RFE-RL, and elements of political warfare never went away. With the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, official U.S. policy was once again redirected at defeating communism, and the strategists emerged triumphant, occupying many senior positions at both VOA and RFE-RL. The Reagan administration resurrected the original concept of the radios as weapons and gave broadcasters wide latitude in developing strategic broadcasts that exposed the fault lines of the Soviet regime. VOA was encouraged to invite prominent dissidents to the studios and to broadcast the works of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. RL had a free hand in airing more programs on conservative philosophy and religion. These were both major developments for both radio stations, but the core news and current affairs programming remained true to the well-established precepts advocated by the purists and continued to live up to high journalistic standards. When I joined the radios in the early 1980s, my principal task was to keep the strategists and the purists in a healthy and creative balance. These two approaches were instrumental in producing the kind of programming mix that proved to be relevant.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?